Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the Gospel of Matthew and chapter 12. Matthew's Gospel and chapter 12. Regardless of your particular interests in life, you will know that people don't always live up to the expectations that other people have of them. It happens, for example, in sport all the time. When the fans have enormous expectations of their team, and I'm sure you've been there and been one of them, only to be bitterly disappointed on occasions. I won't mention any in particular, in case I offend someone. It happens in politics, when our leaders don't behave or don't perform as we had hoped they would. It happens in royalty, and it happens in religion. People not living up to expectations. And sometimes that can be due to the person behaving in a bad way, in a way that is disappointing, as we saw last week at the Oscars. But on other occasions, it can be due to unrealistic or unreasonable or misguided expectations on the part of those who have them. And we've seen that happen as we've worked our way through these chapters of Matthew's Gospel. First century Jews had enormous expectations concerning the promised Messiah. But when he finally stepped onto the stage of world history, he didn't always live up to the people's expectations of him. Not because he behaved badly, but because their expectations weren't always accurate. For example, in spite of being the man who baptized Jesus, and in spite of being the man who pointed others to Jesus, even John the Baptist's expectations of the Christ weren't always entirely balanced. And that is why we hear John at the start of chapter 11 sending his disciples to ask, are you the one who was to come? Or should we expect someone else? If you examine the teaching of John, you will see that he concentrated on the righteous judgment aspect of the Messiah's ministry. And although all that he said was true, it wasn't quite the full picture of what the Christ would be and do. That is why on hearing about Jesus' caring and compassionate miracles in chapters 8 and 9, John is in need of reassurance as to whether Jesus really is the long-awaited one that the Old Testament scripture had promised and prophesied. And now that we have reached verse 15 of chapter 12, we see some further actions and attitudes of Jesus that would not have been everyone's expectation of the Messiah. Which leads me to my first point this morning, and that is in verses 15 to 17, and there we see the faithful fulfillment of the Christ. The faithful fulfillment of the Christ. Now, if you were with us a couple of weeks ago, then you may remember that Jesus was challenged by the Pharisees about the rights and wrongs of picking and eating ears of corn on the Sabbath day. During the course of his response, Jesus claimed, verse 8, to be Lord of the Sabbath. And he proceeded to demonstrate the validity of that claim by healing a man's hand on the Sabbath. Now, the healed man would naturally have been thrilled to get the use of his hand back, but there were others present on that occasion who were not quite so thrilled with what had happened, and those were the Pharisees. Verse 14 tells us they went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. And then we read at the very start of verse 15, aware of this, aware of what the Pharisees are plotting and planning, aware of this, Jesus... Now, if you had to finish that sentence, what would you have said? What would you have expected Jesus to do? In view of the fact that he knows the Pharisees are plotting to kill him, how would you have expected Jesus to respond? Over recent months, we have seen people respond in different ways when their lives have been at risk. For example, on the 15th of August last year, Ashraf Ghani flew out of Afghanistan as the Taliban were entering Kabul. He thought it would be better and safer if he quickly cleared out. Whereas in contrast to him, Volodymyr Zelensky refused to leave Ukraine as the Russians entered his country. Different people respond in different ways in that situation, but how did Jesus respond? Well, verse 15 tells us, aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. Many followed him, and he healed all their sick, warning them not to tell who he was. Please note, Jesus hasn't fled the country. He hasn't done a complete runner. He's still available to help people and heal people, but although he's still available to help, he has chosen to keep more of a low profile, in that he has withdrawn from that particular place where the danger exists, and he's telling those who are healed not to publicize his identity. Well, there will come a time, and as you get to the end of Matthew's Gospel, you read about it, there will come a time when he doesn't withdraw from danger, and he doesn't try to keep his messianic identity quiet. There will come a time. But for now, he does. Does that surprise you? Well, it would have surprised a lot of people back then, that's for sure. Because the common expectation about the Messiah back then, as John the Baptist demonstrates to some extent, was that he would be a confrontational, conquering, victorious, kingly figure who confronted any opposition head on. And consequently, there would have been many who, like John the Baptist, on seeing how Jesus is responding to this threat, there would have been many who perhaps were beginning to wonder whether he really was the one who was to come, or should they be looking for someone else. They were perhaps beginning to have doubts due to the surprising response of Jesus. And yet, says Matthew in verse 17, this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. In other words, says Matthew, this is precisely what the Old Testament scriptures had promised and prophesied all along. And so if the actions of Jesus on this occasion don't live up to people's expectations of the Messiah, then it's not because he has let them down. It's because they have wrong expectations. And the reason I say that is because what he is doing is precisely what Old Testament scripture said he would do. What we see on this occasion is yet another example of Jesus fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. What we see here is the faithful fulfillment of the Christ. And as we approach another Easter, this is a very important principle to remember. I say that because as we hear and think about the sufferings and the death of Jesus over the coming weeks, we may be tempted to think that his life and his work, his mission and his ministry were tragically cut short, and therefore he never quite lived up to expectations. And yet, as you read the gospel accounts, you will repeatedly come across the little phrase that Matthew uses in verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. You will come across that phrase or something similar numerous times, even in passages describing the suffering and death of Jesus. Which indicates that if Jesus hasn't quite lived up to our expectations, then it's not because he has failed in any way, it's because our expectations of him were not quite right. And the reason our expectations of him are not always right is because we perhaps haven't properly understood his mission and his ministry. We haven't properly understood the purpose for which he came, lived, suffered and died. And as we come to understand those things better, we will discover that rather than being someone who failed to live up to expectations, Jesus is someone who faithfully fulfilled all that God had previously said he would. That is the faithful fulfillment of the Christ. Secondly, verse 18, and there we see the unique identity of the Christ. The unique identity of the Christ. Now, if you're following the church Bible reading plan, then you will have realized by now just how big the book of Isaiah really is. It takes quite a time to plough through it. And that partly explains why, apart from the Psalms, that partly explains why Isaiah is the Old Testament book which is most often quoted in the New Testament. The sheer size of Isaiah partly explains its frequent use in the New Testament, but it doesn't fully explain it. The other reason it's frequently quoted is because it was Isaiah, more than any other Old Testament prophet, that looked forward and spoke about the coming of the Christ. And amongst the many passages in which he looked forward to that future messianic era, there are 4 specific passages in which he describes the mission and ministry of the future messianic king, and they are known as the 4 servant songs of Isaiah. The first of them appears in the opening verses of Isaiah 42, and it is from there that Matthew is quoting in verses 18 to 21 of this chapter. And as he does so, we hear God saying, "Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations." Throughout the Old Testament era, God had many servants, including prophets such as Isaiah. But what we have here in these verses is God speaking about a special servant of his, a particular servant of his, one whom he had chosen to fulfill a particular role in his plans and purposes for this world, a servant whom he loved like no other, a servant whom he delighted in like no other. And as Matthew surveys the life and work and teaching of Jesus, he has no hesitation in taking the words of Isaiah 42 and applying them to Jesus. And so whatever hesitation John the Baptist may have had regarding the identity of Jesus, and whatever objection the Pharisees may have had regarding the identity of Jesus, the testimony of an eyewitness like Matthew is that this Jesus is the chosen and anointed servant of the Lord. All that the Old Testament prophets looked forward to has found its fulfillment in the person of Jesus Christ. That was Matthew's verdict concerning the identity of Jesus. And what is even more important is that that was also God's verdict. Speaking through his 8th century BC prophet, God had said that one of the ways in which this special servant of his would be identified was that he would put his Spirit on him in a special way. And it was back in chapter 3 of this gospel that Matthew recorded that occasion when Jesus went from the region of Galilee to the river Jordan to be baptized by John. And we are told in verse 16 of that 3rd chapter, as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and resting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." This was God singling Jesus out and identifying him as being unique amongst all those who were baptized by John in the Jordan, and there were many. But this is God singling Jesus out as being unique. This was God singling Jesus out and identifying him as being unique amongst all the servants of God that had gone before, including John the Baptist. This was God singling Jesus out and identifying him as the servant of the Lord par excellence, if you like. The servant spoken of several centuries earlier by the prophet Isaiah. The servant that he is delighted with. What a contrast. Do you see the contrast between the Pharisees' verdict on Jesus? Their verdict was, we're going to kill him. What a contrast between their verdict on Jesus and God's verdict on Jesus. Even if he has not lived up to the misguided expectations of men, he has lived up to God's expectations of him. This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. That was God singling Jesus out and identifying him not only as his servant, but also as his Son. In the person of Jesus Christ, the servant of God was also the Son of God. That is the unique identity of the Christ. Thirdly, verses 19 and 20, and there we see the gentle compassion of the Christ, the gentle compassion of the Christ. Jewish expectation concerning the Messiah was that he would be someone who would come with great displays of power and pomp and pageantry. And consequently, his quiet withdrawal in verse 15 and his turning down of publicity in verse 16 were not what many within Israel were expecting of the coming Messiah. And yet, if they had read their Old Testament scriptures carefully, they would have heard Isaiah say in verse 19, "He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets." Rather than being someone who arrogantly sought publicity and forcefully sought the limelight all the time, the Messiah, says Isaiah, would be someone who would be meek and humble and gentle. And that gentleness would not only be seen in his attitude towards publicity, it would also be seen in his attitude towards people. The prophet says in verse 20, "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out." That was way before the days of plastics or steel or all the other fancy man-made materials that we have these days. And it meant back in those days that natural materials were used for almost everything in life. For example, reeds. You can picture a big long reed growing at the side of the river. Reeds would have been used for measuring. Can you imagine doing your homework with a reed? Yes, it's 3.6 meters. They would have been used for measuring, or they would have been used for support in the construction of buildings. But once its strength, or once its straightness had been lost due to either bending or cracking or whatever, it would have been of no use whatsoever, and consequently it would have been discarded. If it wasn't a perfectly straight reed, strong reed, it would have been of no use to anyone. Likewise, strips of living cloth were used for wicks and lamps, but a cloth that smouldered, that was more a cause of pollution than a cause of light, and consequently that would have been thrown on the rubbish heap as well. The picture is of things that don't function properly. The picture is of things that are not quite what they ought to be. The picture is of things that are substandard, things which are broken. And whereas in normal life such broken things would have been rejected and thrown out, Isaiah's description of the coming Messiah is that he would not break a bruised reed or snuff out a smouldering wick. It's a picture of someone who has time for the broken, and rather than destroy them, will do what he can to restore them. And we've seen that in the previous passage in Matthew chapter 12, have we not? In contrast to the Pharisees, who had no time for and no sympathy for the paralyzed man, Jesus took the time to heal him. And even although he's now withdrawn from the limelight, verse 15, he still has time for such people. Did you notice that? People that the religious hierarchy dismissed as being redundant rejects of society. Jesus demonstrated a kind and a compassionate and a gentle approach to such people, doing all that he possibly could to help them. And as you work your way through the Gospels, you discover that his concern for the broken people of society was not only seen in his miracles, it was also seen in the entirety of his ministry and mission. For example, back in chapter 9, verse 12, we hear him saying, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." You see, our brokenness this morning goes much deeper than our physical or our emotional or our social needs. According to Jesus, we are all broken in a fundamental sense, in that we are not the people that we ought to be. We are not the people that we were created to be. Rather than living for God's glory and his agenda, as we were meant to do, we have lived for ourselves and for our own agenda. Rather than living in obedience to our Creator, as we were meant to do, we have lived in disobedience towards him. That is what the Bible calls sin. But rather than break or snuff out those who had failed miserably in the sight of God, Jesus came for such people. It was for those very people, says Jesus in Matthew 9. It is for those very people that I have come. Rather than automatically discard all such broken sinners onto the trash heap of hell, Jesus came into the world for such sinners, for sinners like you and me. It was for such broken, hell-deserving people like us that he left the splendor of heaven and was born into this world. It was for such broken, hell-deserving people like us that he lived on this earth, that he died on the cross, and that he rose again. He did so in order to restore those who were broken and failed in the sight of God. He did so in order to restore them to a relationship with God and to usefulness in the service of God. And so, contrary to popular expectation back then, he was a Messiah who had and still has time and compassion for broken sinners like you and me. And he will continue to do so, end of verse 20, until that future day when divine justice is victorious, in that it is fully executed and finally implemented throughout the world. Until that day, he will continue to have time and compassion for sinners like you and me. And therefore, if you recognize your need of him this morning, your need of restoration, your need of forgiveness, your need of salvation, your need of that security for eternity that only he can give. If you recognize your need of him this morning, then come to him in repentance and faith. And you will discover, as Isaiah said many centuries previously, you will discover that a bruised reed like you, he will not break, and a smouldering wick like you, he will not snuff out. That is the gentle compassion of the Christ. Fourthly, and finally, verse 21. And there we see the global mission of the Christ, the global mission of the Christ. Now, throughout the Old Testament era, God's work in this world was focused primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on one nation, and that was the nation of Israel. And however much the weak and the poor and the lame within first century Israel were dismissed as being redundant rejects of society, there was another category of people who were viewed as being even worse than that, and that was the inhabitants of nations other than Israel, i.e. Gentiles. The Gentiles were really the scum of the earth as far as the Jews, and particularly as far as the Pharisees were concerned. And consequently, it was assumed that when the Messiah did eventually come, it was assumed that he would focus his attention and he would concentrate his efforts on Jewish people only. But already within Matthew's Gospel, we've seen that that wasn't an accurate expectation. Already within Matthew's Gospel, we've seen Jesus engage with a Roman centurion, chapter 8, verse 10, and comment on his remarkable faith. Such interactions with Gentiles infuriated the Pharisees and led many within Israel to question whether Jesus could possibly be the Messiah. And yet, if they had read their Old Testament scriptures carefully, and if they had read Isaiah 42 carefully, they would have noticed that the Lord's servant was always going to have a ministry to the nations, plural, and not just to the nation, singular. For example, at the close of verse 18, we read, "And he will proclaim justice to the nations." Verse 21, "In his name the nations will put their hope." That was God speaking through his prophet away back in the 8th century BC, and it indicates that it was always God's intention that his servant would have a global ministry, and that he would be received and believed by people globally. Rather than being something that God thought up later as a result of seeing the unbelief of many Jewish people and thinking, oh boy, I better come up with some other agenda. No, the worldwide spread of the gospel and the worldwide reception of the gospel was always God's agenda. Far from being a plan B in God's thinking, the incorporation of Gentiles amongst the people of God was always God's plan. And it is we, of all people, who ought to be extremely grateful for that this morning. And I say that because most, if not all of us, are from the nations. We are Gentile people by birth. And if anyone hasn't lived up to expectations, if anyone hasn't lived up to the expectations of their Creator, then it has been us, that's for sure. That is why Paul can later describe people like us, Ephesians 2 verse 12, as being people who are without hope and without God in this world. If ever anyone constituted a bruised reed that deserved to be broken, or a smouldering wick that deserved to be snuffed out by their Creator, it was us. But rather than do that, God in his grace has sent his chosen servant, his dearly beloved Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, and through faith in his sacrificial substitutionary death upon the cross, broken Gentile sinners like you and me, regardless of our nationality, regardless of our ethnicity, regardless of our social status. Through faith in Christ, people like us can be forgiven by God. Gentile people like us can be restored to a relationship with God. Believing Gentile people like us can be incorporated into the believing people of God. That is the great news of the Christian gospel this morning. That is the great news of the Christian gospel, not for people of one particular nation, not for people in one geographical location. That is the great news of the Christian gospel for people throughout our world this morning. And the only reason it's true, and the only reason it's possible, is because the Christ had a global mission. 4 things we learn about Jesus, the servant of the Lord. Firstly, we see the faithful fulfillment of the Christ. Secondly, we see the unique identity of the Christ. Thirdly, the gentle compassion of the Christ. Fourthly, the global ministry, our mission of the Christ.